Active History is pleased to present a recording of Michel Hogue's talk, Setting the Plains on Fire, How Indigenous Geo-Politics and the U.S. Dakota War Shaped Canada's Westward Expansion. The talk was delivered on April 22, 2017, as part of the Other 60s, a decade that shaped Canada and the world, a symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a delight to be here. I'm going to take us back to where we just were a few minutes ago by returning to Red River and turning to that complicated decade of the 1860s, which Jean Taillé brought vividly to life in her presentation. I'm going to go a little bit earlier to the earlier parts of the decade, beginning with an incident that began and that really came to a head a few years earlier in 1863. It was in 1863, in December in particular, that some 600 Dakota men, women, and children found themselves in the settlement. Among them were two chiefs known in the press as Little Six and Medicine Bottle, or Shakopee and Wakanajan, who were among the Mdewakanton Dakota bands that had been most closely associated with a violent conflict in the Minnesota River Valley in August and September of 1862, a conflict referred to often as the U.S. Dakota War. White survivors of the bloody confrontations in Minnesota's frontier settlements blamed these two leaders with some of the worst atrocities of that summer. The Dakota Band was one of the largest to arrive in Red River in the aftermath of the war, but it was hardly the first. Ever since the outbreak, a number of Dakota delegations had made short visits to Red River. This group, however, seemed prepared to stay. According to the Hudson's Bay Company's Governor-in-Chief of Rupert's Land, Alexander Dallas, they were, quote, in a state of positive starvation. Poorly clad and lacking in basic supplies, they arrived just as winter temperatures dipped as low as 40 or 50 degrees below zero. While they looked initially to others in the settlement for support, many in Red River were themselves staring down what promised to be a lean, cold winter thanks to a succession of crop failures and a partial failure of the fall buffalo hunt. In addition, the arrival of U.S. troops at Pembina, just on the border in that previous fall, had driven up market prices for already scarce foodstuffs. Red River residents, who were increasingly anxious about the Dakota presence, urged Governor Dallas to allow U.S. troops to enter British territory or to arm settlers so that they could drive the Dakotas off themselves. Some even crossed the border to make their appeals directly to the U.S. Army officer posted just across the border. While Dallas privately negotiated terms for a possible meeting between American military officers and Dakota leaders, discussions that would eventually see Dallas extend permission to the Americans to cross the border with their troops, something that did not in the end happen, the officer put into place a plan to capture these two Dakota leaders. One January evening, an American who resided in Red River and his French-Canadian counterpart plied the two chiefs with drink, then used laudanum and chloroform to render them unconscious. Shakopee and Wakanajan were transported to Fort Snelling, present-day St. Paul, where they were tried in November 1864. In October 1865, a crowd of between 10,000 to 15,000 Minnesotans assembled to witness their execution. In many respects, the causes of the outbreak of the U.S. Dakota War aren't all that different from many of the other conflicts, well-known conflicts that flared across the United States West during the mid-19th century, conflicts that all centered on land. The immediate causes in the case of the Dakotas could be traced back at least as far to a treaty concluded between the Dakotas and the U.S. in 1851 that saw the cession of 24 million acres of Dakota lands, and then, of course, to the subsequent failures of the U.S. government to deliver on the terms of those treaties. The spark came with a full-blown subsistence crisis and festering conflicts with local Indian agents and traders. On August 17, 1862, those pent-up frustrations exploded into violence, and violence that just cascaded outwards. And in the end, the death toll was staggering. Nearly 500 Euro-Americans and an unknown number of Dakotas lost their lives. And this scene is one that you'll see reprinted frequently in the histories of the American West that commemorates and marks the execution of 38 Dakota men at the in 1862, and which today, until this day, remains the largest mass execution in American history. And I should say that some of these images come from the macabre sort of cottage industry that arose in the aftermath of the war, the sale of photographs, carte de visite, and the like that circulated in Minnesota and beyond, and even in the pieces of bodies and such that were put on display in local museums and the like. Although the Dakota militants involved in the actual fighting were a small fraction of the overall Dakota population, the conflict soon engulfed the entire Dakota Nation and many others across the plains. Indeed, the need to placate a vengeful settler population led the Army to redirect its resources from Civil War battlefields to the south and to initiate repeated campaigns in the following years aimed at driving the Dakotas farther onto the plains and away from Minnesota settlement. And in so doing, the Army transformed the violence in Minnesota into a much larger conflict, effectively setting the plains on fire. As fighting engulfed neighboring indigenous nations like the Sisseton and the Wahpetons, who had refused to join in the fighting in Minnesota, and even the Lakota, Yankton, Yanktonai, who had few obvious ties to the events there. And at the territorial edges of the United States, the effects of this violence were displaced across the international boundary. Members of the Sisseton and Wahpeton bands, as well as some Mdewakanton, 3 of the 5 branches of the eastern Dakota, journeyed deep into the homelands of different indigenous peoples and onto the lands administered by the British Hudson's Bay Company. I begin then with this shocking cross-border rendition, and the stories as one of the most jarring to emerge from a number of stories about the U.S. Dakota War. As one that captured widespread attention and created, in many ways, a rich multi-vocal archive that shows how Dakota migrations across the international boundary sparked a transatlantic conversation about the future of colonial claims to the northern plains, a conversation in which the actions and intentions of Plains Indigenous people were central. And so in the time that remains, I'm going to trace very briefly how the Dakota arrival triggered those discussions that rippled outwards from Red River to Washington to London and to Canada, and to try and suggest some of the ways perhaps that we can see these as exerting an underappreciated pressure on the conversations that would later come to surround Canada's plans for the annexation of the Prairie West. By tracing these stories, we can connect some of the political conversations within and among Indigenous nations to the national and international discussions that this incident provoked, and to see indeed how Indigenous peoples were, although often hidden from view, were nonetheless at the center of efforts by imperial and national entities to partition the West and to invest its new borders with meaning. While Dakota migrations in search of sanctuary ignited these political conversations in far-flung locales, what we can't lose sight of is the fact that these migrations you see mapped here took Dakota peoples directly into the territories of their neighbors, and sometimes rivals, particularly the Métis and the Anishinaabe, the Saulteaux and Ojibwe to the north. And accordingly, the Dakota's very first diplomatic efforts following the onset of the war were therefore with an Anishinaabe and Métis leaders. Dakota envoys traveled in 1862 and 1863 and routinely met with the political leadership of bands in Pembina and Turtle Mountain, as well as the Métis communities of Pembina and St. Joseph, located just south of the 49th parallel, where Dakota leaders concluded and reaffirmed a variety of peace treaties with various leaders. These weren't necessarily new. Certainly, political agreements of this sort were a regular feature of life on the 19th century plains, especially as mobile hunting bands were routinely forced to come to terms with their neighbors. And on the northern plains, the history of relations between Dakota, Métis, and Anishinaabe had long been punctuated by violence. Indeed, in the previous 2 decades, in the 1840s, Métis and Ojibwe buffalo hunting parties and Dakota war parties reached a crescendo, most famously in the Battle of the Grand Coteau, which is sort of lived on in Métis oral history as a defining moment in Métis national history. At the same time, though, these leaders also routinely negotiated a series of understandings or truces or other agreements that were carried out under the rituals and protocols of Plains diplomacy. It was common in the 1850s, for example, for the Dakotas to travel to Fort Garry in the spring to meet with Métis leaders prior to the commencement of the Métis buffalo hunts in order to ensure a kind of peaceful hunt and to exchange gifts, to smoke the calumet or the peace pipe as a way to minimize those chances of violence. These agreements were, as Adam Gaudry argues, part of what he calls a cautious diplomatic effort during the 1840s that allowed Métis and Dakota to mobilize a common language that transformed these groups from strangers into kin and brokered accommodations, sometimes tenuous, but accommodations nonetheless between the members of these groups. However tenuous these accommodations were, they provided the basis for the ongoing presence of the Dakotas after 1862. It's something that's fundamental that so quickly falls out of the diplomatic correspondence. If you were to just look at the diplomatic correspondence or the high-level political discussions that emerge from this, that at base, that you would miss that at base that there are these the fundamental agreements that have to be made between Métis and Dakota, Anishinaabe and Dakota, in order for the Dakotas to remain. In those moments of failures, though, we see all kinds of instances, low-level murders or violence that occurred in Red River in 1862 and 1863, the kind of thing that sort of underscored the very tenuous nature of these accommodations. And that, in turn, that prospect of violence and of ever-increasing violence shaped Hudson's Bay Company reactions to the Dakota presence. For example, in the representations to HBC officials, leaders like Mdewakanton Chief Little Crow, who you see here, routinely referred to earlier alliances forged between Dakota and the British in the context of the War of 1812, when the Dakota bands had sided with the British in their military conflict with the U.S. That experience of alliance was in Little Crow's family. His grandfather had sided with the British in 1812, and he and some of the others of his band traveled to Fort Garry bearing the medals stamped with the likeness of King George III stamped on them, and along with the flags, and as a kind of material reminder of past agreements and promises. HBC officials dismissed these as pretended treaties that were just referred to by the Dakotas as a kind of way to secure what they needed from the British, namely arms and ammunition. And they saw any kind of agreements that the Hudson's Bay Company might reach with the Dakotas as a potential complication. A complication with relations with the United States, but also a complication with their relations with local indigenous peoples. In these same years, in 1862 and 1863, the conversations around Anishinaabe land rights began to heat up as Chief Peguis, for example, supported by the Aborigines Protection Society, began to articulate ever more forcefully their concerns about their lack of HBC title to those lands. These sorts of fears that perhaps that in engaging with the Dakotas or that there might be a small incident of violence that could snowball into something much larger colored the imagination of Alexander Dallas, who warned his superiors about the potential that violence might inflame tensions between Dakota, Métis, and Anishinaabe, prompting violence like that which had rocked Minnesota. Dallas also worried about what might happen should the Dakotas, desperate for food or shelter or whatever supplies they needed after months on the run from the U.S., help themselves to whatever they might require. Dallas also warned that ineffectual resistance by the HBC could lead to serious consequences, including war. And the result would be expensive as well as potentially devastating to Britain's ability to keep its hold on this part of the continent. And this was especially so given the fact that since 1861, when the Royal Canadian Rifle Regiment had been removed from Fort Garry, the HBC was left without a military force or even a constabulary it could rely upon to enforce its laws and regulations. It was not by accident, then, that the Dakota delegations to St. Norbert and Fort Garry were met by armed members of the Métis Buffalo hunting brigades. In the absence of a formal police or military force, the HBC counted on the martial presence of the Métis to put on that show of force. These incidents remind us that, however, the Hudson's Bay Company sort of referred to their claims over the Northwest, these remained in the 1860s thinly spread over top of those of other Indigenous nations. In Red River, then, the political prerogatives of Dakota, Métis, and Saulteaux were hard to miss. And the face-to-face negotiations among these groups yielded the sorts of accommodations that allowed the Dakota to remain north of the border. And these political arrangements also drove HBC policy on the ground, although their significance resonated well beyond Red River. In the U.S., for example, these kinds of tentative accommodations attracted the attention of military officers in particular, who saw the ability of the Dakota to reach some agreements with the HBC and to remain north of the border as a threat in particular to Minnesota's frontier settlements. American officials charged that HBC policies actually enabled Dakota resistance and posed an ongoing threat to American settlements. And these charges emerged in 1863, hashtag Trent Affair, at the moment when Civil War relations between these two nations were really at a low point. And American outrage was stoked further still, as you see from this excerpt here, when Americans petitioned for permission to cross the border into the Red River settlement in order to pursue the Dakotas, something which the British refused to allow. In lodging the complaint that you see here, General John Pope, the Army's division commander for the Plains, gave voice to a series of complaints and demands that would become a common refrain among U.S. military officials for the remainder of the decade, that if the British could not prevent cross-border movement of Indigenous peoples, then they should allow the Americans to do so. And Army files bulge in the 1860s and 70s with reports of illicit movement back and forth across the border, and particularly with the tightening relations between Métis traders and the Dakota, a relationship that Americans were certain was fundamental to allowing sustaining Dakota autonomy and resistance, and later that of the Lakota and many other Plains Indigenous nations all across the Great Plains. The news, and so it was a matter that was given received the president's attention, resulting in the proclamation that you see here, reprinted in the Northwester, that was warning those traders of actually continuing that kind of traffic. The other political complications posed by the Dakota presence and, in fact, news of this cross-border kidnapping also focused attention on the HBC's charter at the moment when the HBC's position in Red River and the Northwest were under attack from various quarters. When the HBC governor, Edmund Head, pleaded with the Colonial Office to send British troops to Red River to help meet these challenges, that request ran headlong into the negotiations then ongoing over the political fate of Rupert's Land and the HBC's claims to it. The HBC's efforts to retain a hold on its mercantile trade empire had been buffeted in preceding decades by the spread of economic liberalism, by changing political currents in Britain, and of course by the challenges of Métis traders and political leaders who, in the 1840s, had proven the company's trade prohibitions in Red River to be a dead letter. And that position became ever more tenuous after 1857, when a select committee of the British House of Commons concluded that the HBC ownership on the prairies should be wound down and that settlement of the region should be promoted. And that ongoing shift in the political conversations about the region's fate in the UK really confirmed the slow unraveling of the mercantile colonialism of the HBC. And it found expression furthermore in the plans and hopes of the colonial secretary, the Duke of Newcastle, who suggested in a bill he presented to the House in 1860 that Red River and southern portions of Rupert's Land should be turned into a crown colony. The Duke, for whom settlement and empire were closely intertwined, saw this proposal as a first step to securing flourishing agricultural communities in the West. In this context, the HBC's request for the deployment of imperial troops to meet the perceived threats posed by the Dakota arrival became a way for the colonial office to press its agenda in those negotiations. And they refused that request as a way to strengthen their hand in those negotiations and to force the HBC into concessions, particularly in the question of turning Red River into a colony. Privately, some within the colonial office worried that the crisis triggered by these events might well force the government's hand, though, the British government's, and force it to assume responsibility for the governance of Red River. Frederick Rogers, the permanent undersecretary, compared Red River to British Kaffraria in southern Africa, a colony that the British government had turned into a crown colony in the 1860s, only to see it annexed to the Cape Colony after economic problems threatened to bankrupt it. Rogers considered Red River to be just as inaccessible as the southern colony and just as unable to support itself. Others, like the Duke of Newcastle, saw in these events an opportunity, something that might force the HBC to rid themselves of the duty, in his words, of governing Rupert's Land. As he said, it is better and more natural that this settlement should be viewed as a Canadian dependency governed from Canada. The political storm that emerged with the news of the cross-border kidnapping of the two Dakota leaders, which led the British House of Commons to ask for an investigation into the matter, only added to this desire. As one historian has noted, in the political dilemmas posed by the Dakota arrival, some of the colonial secretary's advisors began to look wistfully to Canadian annexation as a possible solution. And indeed, in 1864, as political leaders in the British North American colonies made their plans known to press forward with negotiations for this larger political union, officials in London increasingly came to see in those plans a solution to the problem of governance at Red River. I don't have time to go deep into the story of that annexationist movement, one that's probably well known to you, one that really that worried about the fears of American annexation, something that this incident heightened dramatically, given that American troops were now camped exactly on the border at Pembina. And that this incident involved, once it hit the press, news that erroneously, that Dallas had actually given permission, without the sanction of the imperial government, for U.S. troops to cross the border, really generated a firestorm in the Canadian press. And it became an opportunity in those newspapers then to engage with this incident, to underscore the threat to British sovereignty, but also to highlight the threats posed by American expansionism in many ways. Various newspapers in Great Britain and Canada took pains to blame the outbreak of violence in Minnesota on the very failure of American Indian policies and to point out the particular brutality of American frontier relations. While the incident served as a kind of cautionary tale that underscored the centrality of land and dispossession in the conflicts in the U.S., it somewhat paradoxically suggested that a more orderly approach to settlement would in fact guard against such violence. And we see in this story then the meanings and morals of it being played out in the competing press coverage. One in Canada that could be used to tell parables about both the failures of HBC governance and the failures of American frontier relations. In reading this archive, then, that was generated out of this event, I think it's possible to see the 1860s on the Northern Plains as an important pivot point, when changing modes of colonialism and new iterations of empire augured profound political, social, and environmental changes for the region's inhabitants. And there's certainly no denying that's the significance of the decade for the Dakotas, who experienced sort of the systematic efforts to dismantle their autonomy in the aftermath of the war. But they also, the events of the war exerted pressure on neighboring indigenous nations and on those with colonial designs on the Northern Plains. The recalibration of relations between Indigenous political leaders drove policies on the ground in Red River and would, for over the following decades, remain a focal point for officials in the U.S. and Canada who remained concerned about these relations and their significance in their efforts to shore up national boundaries. These prerogatives often don't figure very prominently in the diplomatic correspondence. They're easy to miss. And they've been easy to miss in the Canadian historiography as well. Deemed to be a part of the U.S. national story, Canadian historians, in overlooking these, I think, have also been complicit in overlooking the way that they're implicated in these colonial histories, and the way that the stories told in Canada, particularly the distinctions drawn with the U.S., have provided a neat justification for Canadian land taking. And in this case, the tethering of Plains Indigenous histories to centrist historiographies has made it easy for observers and historians to take this partition landscape of the 49th parallel and to take it as a given and to read it backwards into history. Thank you.
You've been listening to a recording of Michel Hogue's talk, Setting the Plains on Fire, How Indigenous Geo-Politics in the U.S. Dakota War Shaped Canada's Westward Expansion. The talk was delivered on April 22, 2017, as part of the Other 60s, a decade that shaped Canada and the world, a symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto. You can find recordings of other talks at ActiveHistory.ca, and be sure to subscribe to the History Chats podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts.